15th General Assembly, I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all to the second day of the Assembly. As you've already figured out from the program, we are going to have this morning the Cheikh Anta Diop lecture, which will be delivered by His Excellency, former President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. The session will be chaired by Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, and I do not know if I need to introduce Professor Olukoshi, popularly known as Bayo. He is a former Executive Secretary of CODESRIA. He is the Regional Director at the moment of International IDEA Africa Office, and we are glad that he accepted our invitation to chair this session. And without wasting your time, I would like to ask Bayo to take the stage.
Thank you very much indeed, Godwin. Your Excellency, President Thabo Mbeki. In West Africa, once you have been a prime minister, minister, or president, you keep that title for life. So I'm not even going to say ex-president. You may not keep the office for life, but you keep the title for life. So, Your Excellency President Thabo Mbeki, President, members of the Executive Committee of CODESRIA, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I was given an official biographical note to read on you, Mr. President. I looked at it. I felt it was too dry. I always like to tell a story around personalities like you, people who have had a great impact on our lives as Africans and on the journey which we have traveled in the struggle for liberation. And in your particular case, Mr. Mbeki, there's something which is, I think, unique about your presence here today. I was asking Jimmy, Adeshina, and later on Tandika yesterday, and it was actually in 1993, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of CODESRIA, that your father, Governor Mbeki, was actually welcomed by this council and honored with the first ever award of a distinguished fellow of CODESRIA. You are here today as the Cheikh Anta Diop lecturer. I don't know if they have anything in stock to confer a distinguished award to you, but in many ways, one can say that this also reflects your life story. Your father, before you, together with the likes of Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela, dedicated their lives to the struggle for the liberation of our continent. In this specific case, the liberation of South Africa from the apartheid system that had come to overwhelm the country and much of Southern Africa. You went into the liberation struggle at the age of 14. At the age of 14, and subsequently took military training in the Soviet Union, returned to Zambia to join the ANC, and in many ways the ANC has been your life and your life story ever since. In the period after the end of apartheid, you became the first deputy president of an independent South Africa, and after Mandela's first term and only term in office, you were elevated justifiably to the position of President of the Republic, a position which you resigned following some of the dramatic events that took place in Polokwane, where as head of the ANC, you did not return to that position. And when asked by the Executive Committee of the ANC to step down from the office of State President, you actually accepted. Shock. Because actually, constitutionally, there was nothing that said you needed to step down from the office of president. but I think it also underscored the life of principle and discipline and respect for organizational policy and direction that you have exemplified all through your experience. And I think for this, many were grateful to you that in many ways you averted what could have been perhaps one of the biggest political constitutional crises in post-apartheid South Africa. Graciously stepped aside, made perhaps one of the most powerful speeches of your entire political career to the people of South Africa as you bade them goodbye. But you have remained in active public life ever since, helping to found your own foundation, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, which has also spawned the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute at UNISA. You have, of course, been given many awards around the continent. I think in my own native Nigeria, we often claim that you are one of our honorary citizens, having been a representative of the ANC in Nigeria for a period of time, and currently serving also as the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, for which... Okay, UNISA guys. I'm warning you because Ahmadu Bello University were a bit outnumbered here. I just want to remind you that Ahmadu Bello University was the first. And the president can attest to the works of the Zaria School that Ahmadu Bello represented. I think one of your ongoing projects, which is the Presidential Library Project, is perhaps one which is not popularly known yet amongst many in this audience, but which hopefully when it is completed will represent perhaps one of the best legacies that you would be leaving for the continent of Africa, summarizing not only your own journey, but also the entire story of liberation of our continent. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I present to you President Thabo Mbeki.
Thanks a lot, Bayo. This table of mine is very small. Is this thing required here? No. No, thanks a lot, Bayo, for that very generous introduction. Our executive secretary, when he spoke just now, he said something that was incorrect. He said I was going to deliver a lecture. That's not true. He's been insisting on this thing for days and days. We are dealing with this topic around Africa and the crisis of globalization. And I think that, in a sense, that requires that we start off with some understanding of what we mean by globalization. Used in the context of this assembly. So let me start with a quotation from a famous German philosopher, economist, and all sorts of things. And he said the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warrant for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaling the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. And these idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. And on their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations with the globe for a theater. It begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes giant dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin war, and is still going on in the opium wars against China. And it's as the different momenta of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. And in England, at the end of the 17th century, they arrive at a systematical combination embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. And these methods depend in part on brute force, the colonial system. But they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society to hasten, hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. And force is the midwife of every old society, pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. And later says the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of production, draws all, even the most backward nations, into civilization. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what they call civilization into their midst. That is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world in its own image. Of course, being very educated people, we know I've been quoting Karl Marx. And is describing what is the principle, what is the first motive force, which results in what has come to be called globalization, which is capital moving across boundaries to transform the whole world, the globe, into one market, which then becomes that globalization. And a group of African scholars and others have written that globalization of the economy includes the internationalization of trade, capital investment, finance, business, and the technology of production. And the dynamics of globalization occur not only in the economic sphere, but also tangible and perceptible in the areas of communications and transportation. And they say it is easy to observe and quantify the vast flow of capital, goods, and services around the world, as in observing the distribution of images and ideas across national borders through antenna dishes and television sets. And I think Jomo yesterday, Sundaram, very adequately described the impact of that process of globalization, which is a transformation of the whole world into one market by dominant capital. He described the impact of that process of globalization on Africa. And I think very adequately, very correctly. So it should not be necessary for me to repeat that. There is, you know that Fidel Castro, the late Fidel, was a very eloquent person. He knew how to describe things. And he talked about this particular matter of the matter that Jomo was discussing. And described this process of globalization as people who are traveling in one boat, but in different classes of the boat. And some were traveling in first class, and therefore could enjoy all sorts of luxuries. And others were some traveling in that where the masses are. And he said that is the impact of globalization. It discriminates, again I'm saying in the manner that Jomo spoke about yesterday. Now part of the challenge I think we've faced as Africans with regard to this matter is that neoliberal thinking on matters of this kind has said that this process of globalization is a natural process of the development of capitalism. In a sense, it enjoys the force of nature. You can't do anything about it. It happens. You can't say, please stop the world, I want to come off, because the world won't stop. So we have no choice. No choice but to get on board this boat of globalization and see how best you can adapt. It's the same notion about that neoliberalism takes towards a capitalist system as such, and therefore even would then argue about these things about free markets, about liberalization, about small states, don't interfere. What elsewhere has been called market fundamentalism. But the fact of the matter is that it's not possible. It's not possible for us as Africans who experience that negative impact of globalization, as was described by Jomo yesterday, to stand aside and do nothing because neoliberal philosophy says do nothing. So I want to say a few words about these international responses. Our responses to this process of globalization, which relates to the rest of the world, necessary responses. I will not talk about what we might want to do domestically within the continent about this. I'm talking about the relations between Africa and the rest of the world. Let me start off by telling you a story. We, at the beginning of in 2001, the OAU adopted NEPAD, agreed on NEPAD. We then engaged the G8. The G8 and said to them, here we are. The OAU has adopted NEPAD. This is Africa's vision about its own development. And we want you, G8 countries, to refashion, to remodel your relations with the African continent based on this development program that the Africans themselves have elaborated. So the EU agreed. In 2002, the G8, and so did I say EU? I meant G8. The G8 met in Canada and adopted what they called the G8 Africa Action Plan. If members of CODESRIA are interested, I'm sure you can find it even on the internet. Very interesting. is a very detailed response of the G8 to NEPAD in terms of what they, the G8, would do. In addition to that, we set up a joint institution, a committee representing us, the Africans, and the G8, to oversee the implementation of the G8 Africa Action Plan. And based on what was described as a process of mutual accountability. And part of what we insisted on with regard to that was that the people who would represent the G8 in that committee should be people senior enough in their own countries to have access to the high levels of government. Those of us who are old enough here, like Mahmoud Mamdani, would remember people like Michel Kamdesou. Michel Kamdesou was at some point administrator of the IMF. He was a member of that committee. I'm mentioning him because it was then said these are the people who would have immediate access, for instance, in his case, to Jacques Chirac. So it was that kind of institution which was intended to make sure that the G8 Africa Action Plan is implemented and that we cooperate. That was an intervention in the globalization process to say, with regard to the impact of that globalization process on Africa, we as Africans are saying the following in the context of NEPAD, and therefore we would want you, the G8, to support the approach that the continent was taking. Therefore, of refusing to accede to this neoliberal approach, which was saying the globalization process is, in a sense, irreversible and, in a sense, untouchable. The G8 summit, that was 2002. The G8 summit went to back to Canada in 2010. And it had, the G8 Africa Action Plan had disappeared by then. It ceased to exist. So all of this vision that we had, that we could engage these developed countries to interact with the continent on the basis defined by the continent. I'm saying in 2002 they agreed, by 2010 they had forgotten. And it was a very interesting process because what happened was that because of this arrangement with the G8, there was always an African delegation which attended the G8 summits every year. And I think that process is still continuing to this day. And what used to happen is that as the G8 shifts from capital to capital, or country to country, each country would then choose what element of the G8 Africa Action Plan to emphasize. So I think when it went to the UK, they chose a matter about debt, the forgiving the African debt. That was the focus of the G8 when it met in England, in the UK. I think when it met in France, it was to focus on the question of water. When it went to Italy, I think it was it focused on the matter of child and maternal health. What we didn't realize was that what they were doing was to whittle away the action plan by presenting particular issues out of the action plan every year. But I'm saying that by the time the G8 went back to Canada in 2010, the G8 Africa Action Plan was not even on the agenda. And when our delegation tried to put it on the agenda, they failed. They couldn't get an agreement. It ceased to exist. I think also the Assembly will remember that the last round in terms of the WTO negotiations, the last round that should have been completed through the WTO was called the Doha Development Round. The Doha Development Round, as you know, collapsed. It's never completed. And principally collapsed because the EU and the United States basically refused to remove subsidies on agricultural products. And again, you remember that the Doha Development Round was called the Doha Development Round because it was focused on helping the developing countries. And one of the propositions was that the developing countries had this comparative advantage with regard to agricultural products. And in fact, if the developed world, the EU and the Americans, removed the subsidies on agricultural products, obviously, that would open up enormous, huge markets for the Africans and other developing countries to develop their agriculture to export to these countries. But the Doha Development Round collapsed essentially because these countries refused to remove those subsidies on agricultural products. So here were two attempts to intervene in the system of globalization to address the imbalances that Jomo was talking about yesterday. Both of them failed. We are about to, the negotiations have just started to negotiate a new agreement between the African, Pacific, Caribbean countries with the EU, because the current Cotonou agreement runs out in 2020. So the process has begun to negotiate a new post-Cotonou agreement. Now, just before the negotiation of the Cotonou agreement, there was a meeting of the ACP countries in Libreville, in Gabon. And in that conference, the EU Commissioner for Development made what was, for some of us, a bit of a puzzling statement. He said that we have to negotiate a new agreement post-Lome, but that new agreement must recognize that we are in a post-colonial period. And then he explained this by saying, you see, in terms of the Lome agreement, we've given you people access, duty-free access to our markets for so many things and done so many lovely things for you. This is Portuguese. Man was the Portuguese commissioner for development of the EU, as whatever it was called at the time. And he said, we had all of these lovely concessions which we gave you because we're feeling guilty. We're feeling guilty that we had colonized you. And now that guilt is gone. So when it says post-colonial, Cotonou must be based on this notion of a post-colonial period. He meant that. No more guilt on their part, and therefore no more concessions. And that became clear what they meant, because then we all of us, everybody, the ACP countries, negotiated the Cotonou Agreement, and it included the economic partnership agreements. Then it became very clear what the professor from Portugal had meant by post-colonial period, because indeed the EPAs are based on the notion of reciprocity. That rather than us, the developed countries, giving you all of these concessions because we're feeling guilty, we must now, in this post-colonial period, base the relationship on reciprocity. True, phased in that reciprocal relationship, but I think all of us in the room are perfectly familiar with the problem that this has caused. Many countries on the continent have refused to sign the EPAs. Many countries have had to sign. Once I had to talk to one of the presidents here in West Africa who had intended to sign, but another country on the continent in West Africa, he asked me, they said, can you please talk to him not to sign? So I said, all right, I'll do that, which I did. And this one I was talking to said, yes, indeed, we're going to sign, but because we understand everybody in the region is signing, I said, no, not everybody is signing. That's not correct. Okay, if you say so, I won't sign. And then he added, so long as the stomach allows me not to sign. So of course I had to get an explanation what this meant. And he said to me, you see, you know what happens. What the EU will do, I won't sign, as you have said, but what they will do, they will pick on one of the products which we're exporting to the EU and impose tariffs. And I'll have to succumb. He says, that's what I mean. So I said to him, I understand. Now, that what I'm saying, as we're progressing to the Cotonou agreements, we're told by the EU that we had to do an agreement which should be based on this post-colonial notion, which produced Cotonou and the EPAs. Now let me say something, just read something here. Some of the arguments against the EPAs, that these trade agreements may not automatically lead to more trade, and indeed that during the 40 years that the ACP countries have had preferential access to the European market, exports from these regions to the EU actually declined. And that despite the bridging period, the ACP countries fear that the EU exporters will get preferential access to their markets too quickly, therefore harming local producers. That the EPAs make it harder for the ACP countries to protect their infant industries by increasing competition in the market for their specialized products. That the EPAs may have a lock-in effect on ACP countries. And given increased regional integration, they may be bound to the region with which an EPA was being negotiated. And they said the main basis of EPA is quota-free and duty-free access to the EU single market may fade quickly due to competition from other non-ACP states concluding free trade agreements with the EU. At that time, when this process of was beginning of the process of this negotiation of EPAs, from a member of the European Parliament, who had been in charge of the Parliamentary Trade Committee of the European Parliament, said outside of the Director General for Trade, it has been impossible to find anyone with a good word to say for the EPAs. I'm saying that's a practical reality, the experience we've had with the EPAs coming out of the Cotonou Agreement. We are now going for a post-Cotonou agreement. What we are going to do with regard to that, I don't know. Because, of course, as you know, for us, the African countries, Caribbean, Pacific, that relationship with the EU is very important in terms of the economic development of our countries. It's another intervention with regard to this globalization process, which we need to make, but it needs to be a correct intervention in order to address the negatives, which Jomo spoke about yesterday. Now let me say something, read you something that comes from the AU. Talking about these forthcoming negotiations. It says the declaration of the 5th African Union, European Union Summit called for a paradigm shift to an even stronger, this was a summit in Abidjan, it called for a paradigm shift to an even stronger, mutually beneficial partnership in the spirit of shared ownership, responsibility, reciprocity, respect, and mutual accountability and transparency. And said this paradigm shift should inform a new partnership that supports Africa's efforts to consolidate its own acquis from regional integration and make decisions pertaining to its own affairs, rather than leaving such decisions to other structures that are not under the continent's full control. The objective is to help in building peaceful, stable, well-directed, prosperous and resilient states and societies in accordance with the visions of both the unions, EU and AU, and to work together in synergy to advance common interests on the international political scene. Accordingly, in the new partnership, success is not measured in terms of euros received in aid, but rather through how the EU's involvement in Africa helps the continent to achieve its own established targets under Agenda 2063. So the AU is visualizing an agreement post-Cotonou, an agreement with the EU informed by these sentiments. Mutual assistance, all this, and the Europeans are going to come and help us to break the chains. I don't quite know what the basis is for that judgment. Because I'm talking about the experience we had as Africa with regard to NEPAD, that we had with regard to Cotonou, that we had with regard to Doha, and those experiences are negative. And when the AU talks about something that is going to be under the control of the continent with regard to these forthcoming negotiations, is because there was a proposal that the ACP group should be broken up, so that the EU would then negotiate separately with the Caribbean, separately with the Pacific, and separately with Africa. And indeed, at some point, there was an agreement on the African continent to go along with that. Fortunately, it got changed. I'm saying fortunately it was changed because, you know, long time ago, the African Union decided that the Caribbean was its 6th region. So the Caribbean is part of Africa. And it's obvious that in these negotiations with the EU, the Caribbean islands and the Pacific islands would depend greatly on the strength that would be provided in the negotiations by Africa. But we had actually agreed at some point to abandon the 6th region of Africa and go it alone. But fortunately, there was sufficient resistance within the continent to say no. let's go back to this formula where Africa, Pacific, and the Caribbean, that solidarity among these developing countries is sustained, and that those are the negotiations that are continuing. But I'm saying we have a challenge to define what is it that we want to come out of the post-Cotonou agreement. And therefore to define for ourselves what kind of structure, how do we structure our relationship with the EU in the context of that process of globalization? In a manner, again I'm saying, in a manner that addresses the negatives, which Jomo spoke about yesterday. There's another partnership which the continent has, and this one is with Japan. As you know, you recall the TICAD, what is called the TICAD process, which is bilateral relationship between Africa and Japan. And TICAD is meeting in summit in Japan next year in August, I think. And they have a very interesting proposition. They are preparing for making a particular statement at that TICAD summit about peace and security on the continent. And essentially what they are saying is that, yes, they understand why it's necessary where you have situations of conflict to stop the guns firing, form a government of transitional government, draft a constitution, have new elections. Sure, that needs to be done. But it doesn't address the fundamental issue, what caused the conflict in the first place. So they're proposing that it's necessary to come at the issue of the solution of the conflicts on the continent by addressing that matter. What are the fundamental causes of the conflicts, and address them? And you'll find that it's issues of underdevelopment, issues of maldistribution of resources, of economic power, and so on. And therefore that to deal with these issues would require not only silencing the guns, but also investment, development of communities, development of a common citizenship. And are prepared to see what resources they, the Japanese, can invest in processes of that kind. What I'm trying to talk about is these interventions in the globalization process, which would help us to address, I'm saying, these negative things, negative consequences that Jomo was talking about. The opportunities are there for us to intervene, provided we know what it is that needs to be done, provided we know what we can achieve. I think one of the best interaction, global interaction, that Africa has with the rest of the world now in the context of this struggle on issues of globalization is with China. It's an important relationship. And as all of us know, China, of course, is the second biggest economy in the world. And so any interaction on our part with China, therefore, is bound to be of importance in the context of this, placing ourselves within the system of globalization. And for instance, in 2015, you can see the importance of China relative to us and relative to the rest of the world and us. For instance, in 2015, trade between Africa and China amounted to $188 billion. And the next biggest trading partner on the continent was India with 59. The difference be a drop from 188 to 59. The US that year, for instance, was 53 billion. Look at infrastructure investment the same year. Infrastructure investment from China was $21 billion on the continent, and the next biggest was France at 3 billion. So we can see that our largest export and development partner, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa certainly, is China. Now, something therefore very, very interesting and very important about China is that this is a negotiated relationship, because you have what is called FOCAC, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. This is the instrument through which the relationship between Africa and China is negotiated. The last meeting took place now in September in Beijing. Now, these meetings, let's talk about just this last one, would adopt two documents. One document is a declaration. And that declaration is in fact the policy framework which describes how the relationship between China and Africa should be constructed. It's a policy document of that kind. The second one is a program of action, a 3-year program of action. So there's a policy document called a declaration and a 3-year program of action. So there is, coming out of this now September meeting, there will be a declaration that came out of there and a program of action. I'm saying, and it's a very serious relationship. And it's expanding. As you can see from these figures I've been quoting, that China becomes our largest export and development partner for sub-Saharan African countries. And you see the big gaps, the differences in terms of this interaction between us and China relative to other countries. And part of the expansion of that relationship, you would see it even just counting pages. For instance, the program of action that was adopted by FOCAC for 2007 to 2009 was 14 pages, 1-4. The latest program of action for 2019 to 2021 is 47 pages. And the program of action which details what are these actions that need to be taken between China and Africa, negotiated and agreed. Now, if you look at this matter from the Chinese side, you can see that they treat these agreements as being very serious agreements indeed. To give you one example, the Premier of China addressed a World Economic Forum meeting which was held in Abuja in 2014. And he then said certain things that he said needed to be done as a result of discussions that China had had with Africa. That there was need to build a network of high-speed railway lines in Africa, infrastructure development. There was a need to build a network of expressways, roads in Africa. There was need to build an aviation network in Africa. In addition, he said we should promote cooperation on power, telecommunications, and other infrastructural development, and said China is ready to provide financial, personnel, and technological support for infrastructure development in Africa. Now, I'm saying that these matters had been discussed with some of our officials on the continent. But I'm indicating the seriousness with which the Chinese are approaching these agreed, negotiated interventions in the system of globalization so that we could then develop this African infrastructure. Or you take the speech made by the President Xi Jinping at this last meeting of FOCAC in September this year. And he said to build an even closer China-Africa community with a shared future in the new era, China will, on the basis of the 10 cooperation plans already adopted, launch 8 major initiatives in close collaboration with African countries in the next 3 years and beyond. And he then listed them. First, China will launch an industrial promotion initiative. Second, China will launch an infrastructure connectivity initiative. Third, China will launch a trade facilitation initiative. Fourth, it will launch a green development initiative. Next, a capacity building initiative. Then a healthcare initiative. Seventh, a people-to-people exchange initiative, and a peace and security initiative. And he said to make sure that these 8 initiatives are implemented on the ground, China will extend $60 billion of financing to Africa in the form of government assistance, as well as investment and financing by financial institutions and companies. And this will include $15 billion of grants, interest-free loans and concessional loans, 20 billion of credit lines, the setting up of 10 billion special fund for development financing, and 5 billion special fund for financing of imports from Africa. And we encourage Chinese companies to make at least 10 billion investment in Africa in the next 3 years. And in addition, for those countries, for those Africa's least developed countries, heavily indebted and poor countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing countries that have diplomatic relations with China, the debt they have incurred in the form of interest-free government loans due to mature by the end of 2018 will be exempted. So I'm saying arising out of the last meeting of the Forum of Cooperation on China and Africa, you can see the commitments which China has made, not only to say we commit ourselves to this, but also to allocate the resources, in fact, to do what has been agreed. These are interventions, I'm saying, in the process of globalization, which would help us to address these challenges, again, I'm saying, which Jomo raised with us yesterday. Now, there's a challenge we face as the African continent with regard, just talking about this China thing. Because China then needs a partner on the African continent. When you say, let us develop road infrastructure, let's develop rail infrastructure to connect these African countries, obviously you need the African Union for that purpose. So we need a strong African Union which is able to act in partnership with a development partner of this kind in order to achieve these objectives with regard to the reform of, as it were, of the globalization process. I don't know what discussion the CODESRIA has had on this matter about the African Union. Because, as you know, there is currently a process of reform that is going on of the African Union. Without going into any detail with regard to that matter, my own view is that reform process is in fact weakening the African Union rather than strengthening it. So this instrument that we need to intervene in this globalization process in a manner that addresses the problems Jomo raised about, that instrument is getting weaker rather than stronger. And that's a problem. That poses a problem. It's a matter that I think all of us have to address. The second last point I will make, Bio, is 5 days ago, the National Security Advisor of the US, the Ambassador John Bolton, made an important statement. He announced what he called to be the new Africa strategy of the Trump administration. And he said, and I'm quoting some of the things that he said, this strategy is a result of an intensive interagency process and reflects the core tenets of President Trump's foreign policy doctrine. Importantly, the strategy remains true to his central campaign promise to put the interests of the American people first, both at home and abroad. And under our new approach, every decision we make, every policy we pursue, and every dollar of aid we spend will further US priorities in the region, that's Africa. In particular, the strategy addresses 3 core US interests on the continent. He mentions them. And to come to the nub of this presentation, he says great power competitors, namely China and Russia, are rapidly expanding their financial and political influence across Africa. They are deliberately and aggressively targeting their investments in the region to gain a competitive advantage over the United States. China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands. Its investment ventures are riddled with corruption and do not meet the same environmental or ethical standards as US developmental programs. In Africa, we're already seeing the disturbing effects of China's quest to obtain more political, economic, and military power. Russia, for its part, is also seeking to increase its influence in the region through corrupt economic dealings. Across the continent, Russia advances its political and economic relationships with little regard for the rule of law or accountable and transparent governance. In short, the predatory practices pursued by China and Russia stunt economic growth in Africa, threaten the financial independence of African nations, inhibit opportunities for US investment, interfere with US military operations, and pose a significant threat to US national security interests. And he said, in developing our strategy, we are revisiting the fundamental principles of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan furthered American interests, bypassed the United Nations, and targeted key nations, key foreign economies, rather than dissipating aid across hundreds of programs. Our new foreign assistance strategy will ensure that all US foreign aid in every corner of the globe advances US interests. And countries that repeatedly vote against the United States in international forums or take actions counter to US interests should not receive generous American foreign aid. Too many US administrations have looked at Africa and said it's not strategically important to the United States. However, I disagree with this. Africa is incredibly important to the United States. If we didn't understand it before, the competition posed by China and Russia and others should highlight it for us. And therefore, we're at a turning point in terms of the relations between the United States and Africa. So I'm saying that as Africa, we negotiate an agreement with China, with a program of action. The National Security Advisor of the United States, Ambassador Bolton, says that agreement is hostile to the interests of the United States, and therefore they are going to fight it. I'm trying to place before yourselves this challenge that we need to respond to this process of globalization to reverse the negatives that Jomo was talking about. With a particular experience, I've given some of these examples up to now, where we have a situation where we engage in negotiations with China and come to an agreement. And Washington says what you've negotiated is inimical to the interests of the United States and will fight it. What then do we do? And I'm saying in a situation in which even a very important instrument in our struggle against a negative globalization, the AU, is itself getting weaker. To end, Bayo, I would say that in a way we need to go back to what we tried to achieve with regard to that G8 Africa Action Plan. Now the AU says we've got Agenda 2063, and in the context of the global context, that's the UN, we've got Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. It would seem to me that as a continent, we need to sit down and say, as we pursue the objectives of Agenda 2063 and pursue the objectives of Agenda 2030, how can we use those to restructure our relationship with the rest of the world so that the globalization process produces positive outcomes for us? And therefore try and structure our relations with the rest of the world consistent with the achievement of those objectives in Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. We have a long way to go, particularly with regard to our own capacities and our own will within the continent. That's the last point, therefore, on that matter. In 2015, the African Union Assembly, Heads of State and Government, adopted the report we had prepared on illicit financial flows, and said that we then had a responsibility to report to the Assembly every year on the implementation of the program of action that was included in that report. That was 2015, annual report. We have not submitted even one report. It's now 2018. And the reason we have not submitted any report, because each year when we've asked African countries, member states of the AU to report on what they themselves have decided, at best, each year we only get 2 responses. So the African continent is not answering the questions it should answer about an important matter, which is addressing the issue of illicit financial outflows from the continent. We have not prepared this annual report because I'm saying, at best, when each year we send out a reminder to our states, only 2 African countries respond. That tells us something about our capacity or our willingness to stand up to address these challenges that are posed by the process of globalization. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. You said it wasn't going to be a lecture. So as you started speaking, I was thinking, what might we qualify this to be? And the idea of an intervention. But I think you can see that people felt this was a lecture, and a lecture very much worthy of the memory of Cheikh Anta Diop, who himself, as a scholar, was known to be a very combative spirit, who asked questions, challenged, received wisdom, and posed alternatives. You've worked thus on the basis of your own lived experience through efforts that were made, including when you were in office as president, to respond in a creative way to the discontents of globalization and the way in which we have felt its negative consequences on the continent. Not only in terms of attempting to build an initiative from within the continent through the NEPAD initiative, designed, I think, as part of the broader movement which we are part of to promote a continental renaissance, transform the old OAU into a more people-driven African Union, and so on and so forth. But also to renegotiate the terms of our engagement with the G8 countries. The successes, the failures, the Doha round, and how it became completely stalemated on account of an unwillingness, particularly by the EU and the US, to shift ground around the all-important issue of agricultural subsidies. And you further illustrate the difficult situation in which we find ourselves with regard to the ongoing negotiations around the post-Cotonou agreement, as well as the reaction of most of our countries to the important work which you have led and which was entrusted to you by African heads of state and government around illicit financial flows. You contrasted this with the effort which is being made in the context of FOCAC, Africa-China relations, and the shift, the difference in approach in the relationship between Africa and the G8 and Africa and China, from imposition to negotiation, from rhetoric to a concrete plan of action with milestones that are clearly defined over a 3-year period for implementation. Taken very seriously by China, but perhaps not sufficiently seriously by Africa, not least because of an absence of a proper continental institutional framework and capacity that can enable us effectively to engage China in order to limit the consequences, adverse consequences of globalization on us. And as if that is not enough, the US seems to have woken up, and John Bolton has become the biggest exponent of what is good for Africa. John Bolton, of all people, tells us what is in our interest, what is wrong with China engaging with Africa, and how the United States is about to begin to do something about it. So, Mr. President, this has been a magisterial lecture, actually, for which we should applaud you. I would like us to have a conversation with the President, and it will not be the first time that President Mbeki has engaged the CODESRIA community in conversation. You'd recall, Mr. President, that at the Gallagher Burgers Park Hotel in Pretoria, soon after you and your colleagues announced the NEPAD initiative, a group of us from across the continent, Third World Network Africa, Yao Graham, the CODESRIA Network, Jimmy Adeshina, colleagues at UNISA, said, okay, what is going on here? And how come our presidents went to announce this initiative? We heard about it first in Tokyo when you went for TCAD, and somehow felt something interesting may be happening but we don't understand why it was being announced from outside the continent. And we actually contacted, as CODESRIA, 4 of you who are prime movers of this initiative, and you were the one who offered to engage in a conversation with African scholars. We brought together, I think, about 50 scholars from across the continent to have a half-day dialogue with you on this issue. And I'd like us to reenact that spirit of conversation here this morning. A conversation between a philosophy of thought and a philosophy of action, gather some issues, come back to the president, and then see how many rounds we can take. I'd like it also to be very brief. He has given the lecture. Don't give a lecture. Or a counter lecture, please. No counter lecture, right? Direct to the point, 1 point. I'll take, Mr. President, I'll take maybe 4 or 5 people at a time and then come back to you. Okay, let me start from the front here. Nkolo Foy.
Merci infiniment, Bao. Je voudrais d'abord remercier chaleureusement Son Excellence, Monsieur le Président, pour cette brillante présentation. S'agissant des relations avec le monde, le CODESRIA a fait beaucoup d'efforts au cours des dernières années pour diversifier ses partenariats. Et depuis quelque temps, nous avons mis l'accent sur le partenariat avec la Chine. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle nous avons signé un important mémorandum d'entente il y a à peu près 2 ans. Et ces mémorandums d'entente nous ouvrent des possibilités immenses, notamment en termes de soutien aux actions du CODESRIA. Et le CODESRIA voudrait compter sur votre soutien personnel et votre engagement pour toutes les initiatives qu'il voudra bien prendre, notamment pour permettre le développement des infrastructures du CODESRIA, parce qu'il s'agit là d'un problème extrêmement important, d'une préoccupation de notre institution. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Nkolo Foy. Jimmy Adeshina.
Mr. President, thank you for a very, very stimulating, lecture. My intervention at this stage really is directed at the Executive Secretary of CODESRIA. And Bayo will remember this when he was Executive Secretary, that we tried to launch an initiative what we call Advanced Policy Dialogue. And I think there's probably a need for us to convene a high panel of African intellectuals, work on a key issue, and on the basis of that probably interact with the AU itself. We'll be honoring Samir Amin at this conference, and I think one of the last key concepts that I took away from him, which I've kind of redefine in terms of what do we call the need for sovereign national projects. And on the basis of that, a pursuit of policy sovereignty. And I think this is probably the critical challenge that we face. And I just take one example. It's easy for many of our colleagues to speak glibly about China. And I think, Jomo mentioned yesterday actually disaggregating what we're dealing with here. And I've always said, I'm not really concerned about, what is coming from the side of China. I'm concerned with what is coming from the side of Africans. When you sit across the table with somebody, if you don't take yourself sufficiently seriously, and you go in on the basis of you want people to do things for you without locating this within a particular framework of your own sovereign national project, it becomes quite, a mess thing. So I think as at the what do you call it, business session of the General Assembly, I would like to move here that one of the tasks that we put before CODESRIA, and we have to find will require a situation where the convening thing, this is beyond question of providing transport and accommodation. There is nothing else that people will. It's about commitment and freely giving of our time. Different dimensions of this thing in terms of rethinking a strategic project, which can be conveyed, and on the basis of that, we interact with a body like OAU.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Puleng.
Thank you very much, Professor Olukoshi, and thank you, Patron, for the presentation. I like the idea that you've posited to us, Bayo, that we must have a concert between a philosophy of thinking and a philosophy of thought, or of action. I'm wondering, President Mbeki, the intent and the expressions of commitment by China to the relationship with Africa seems to be offering a viable mode of engagement in terms of the developmental trajectory that we would want to ascertain for ourselves. But it would seem to me that there are fault lines and contradictions that are evident also in the relationship that we have with China that to some extent may be comparable to the colonial conquest that Africa has experienced, where the lived experiences of ordinary citizens who are not elite, who do not have access to the modes of production, economic possibilities, are actually violated. We have many experiences in South Africa, we have many experiences in Lesotho, we have many experiences where China's investment are not as beneficial in terms of the real relationship of reciprocity, egalitarian partnerships and envisioning. So whilst the infrastructural aspects may be enabling, what do we do with an intent that does not enable the full flourishing of humanity that receives the investment of China? And what do we do with the ecological questions? And I'm saying this does not mean, I don't at all agree to the investments by Euro-American interests that are also violating these particular principles. The last aspect is, how do we as Africans therefore ensure that our own investments that China has interest in can actually finance what we want to accomplish ourselves?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll try to accommodate everybody in this conversation, so don't worry if I don't call you in this first round. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much.
Please state your name.
I'm Gracien Achinobe from the University of Buea, Cameroon. Thank you, His Excellency. At the end of your talk, you said that we still have a long way to go. And I think that was a kind of pessimistic way to express what we all feel. This pessimism that started yesterday with Jomo's talk. Now my question is the following. As a president, as a former president, why is Africa not taking off? What is the problem of Africa? You are president, you know some of the problems, you know your colleagues, president, so what is the problem of Africa? Please, I would appreciate it if your answer is as if you are talking to a child who is 5 years old. Thank you.
I thought the president talked about stomach. Okay, I'll come to you, Sheriff. Onalena Selulwani.
All protocol observed. I think when we reach a point where Africans will not be asking somebody for answers, where each one of us feels the obligation to provide those answers, that is where the solution of our problems will come from. Why should Mbeki be the one answering? He's not the only African. We are all Africans. We have to find the answers. Why should China be the one to solve Africa's environmental problems? Why do we not take hold of our own destiny by ensuring that whoever we partner with has to find a partner who knows what they are doing on their own land? It is not up to China to determine for us, to give us answers to our problems. We have to find the solution, each one of us. America tried to solve Africa's problems. Remember in the 1940s, that led to the formation of the United Nations and the various development projects, because America was reacting to the threat of the Soviet Union. Now America is reacting to the threat of China. But what are we as Africans reacting to? We should expect others to guard their own interests. But when are we going to wake up to the fact that our future is in our hands? We ought to negotiate and transform ourselves before we expect anybody else to solve our problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Annalena. Let me come back to you, Mr. President, and just get your reflections on any of those issues. You're welcome.
It's okay, don't worry. I think that I hope the Executive Secretary Godwin took on board what Jimmy was proposing. I think it's very important. I hope all of us understood what he was trying to get at. The need for us as the intelligentsia to be organized to make the strategic interventions on the continent which are required in order to achieve what we call policy sovereignty. And I think we, as members of CODESRIA, therefore an important part of the African intelligence, have got a very important contribution to make in that regard. I'm very glad that Godwin is nodding here. He has accepted the suggestion. I'd said that when FOCAC meets once every year, at 3 years in summit, what comes out of there is a negotiated agreement. It's the only one of its kind in the world. It's negotiated. And therefore, if there is something that's wrong with it, we must take responsibility for that. It surely must be, as our colleague from Botswana just said, it surely must be part of our weakness that we would negotiate an agreement which is against our interests. In 2006, the FOCAC summit took place in Beijing in 2006. And we reached an agreement, with, as I was saying, an agreement, a declaration, and program of action. We then had a bilateral meeting with the government of China, South Africa. And the president at the time of China was President Hu Jintao. So we say to President Hu Jintao, we are very glad that this FOCAC has produced these particular outcomes. There's a problem with them, though. The problem is that the Africans, we as Africans, are too weak to negotiate agreements which are loyal to what has been agreed. And what we fear, we said to him, is that you, as China, will intervene, whether it's state or private or whatever, in a manner which, because of this imbalance in terms of power and capacity, will produce relations between China and Africa which are against African interests, which are negative. In the end, the consequence will be the development of an anti-China feeling on the continent, which we don't want. So we said to him, to President Hu Jintao, we therefore are making a proposal that in terms of whatever agreements you, China, enter with any African country, you must then give us a copy of that agreement, South Africa, so that we look at it and to critique it, so that we're able to point out that this agreement is unbalanced. It favors China too much. We agreed. To this day, there is an agreement between China and South Africa that we can intervene with all the agreements that China has with individual African countries, to assess them, to make a comment. Because I'm saying what we're afraid of was this capacity within the continent to be able to enter into this partnership, a negotiated agreement, given based on its own strength and its capacity. And that's one of the problems. So if I would dare say, if there's anything that the Chinese are doing on the continent, which is negative in terms of the interests of the continent, why don't we engage them? To say what you are doing is inconsistent. Even if it's a Chinese private sector, to say we engage you because this thing that you are doing, which is producing these negative results, is inconsistent with the framework which we have negotiated. I don't know why we don't do that. Give me one little example of this. One day I was talking to, 3 years ago, to a Chinese ambassador. And that ambassador was the roving ambassador, Chinese roving ambassador for Africa. And I was saying to him that, you know, I'm very worried about you people, because it seems to me in terms of your foreign policy, particularly at the UN, you are not paying sufficient attention to African matters. You are too focused on what it is that is closest to China, and these African issues you are putting on a sort of back burner. And he said to me, do you remember the G8 summit which took place in Hokkaido, in Japan? So I said, yes, I do. And you remember that you had a meeting at that, during that summit with President Hu Jintao? I said, yes, I do. And we acted on what you suggested. I said, yes, I remember that. I was meeting this ambassador about 2 years ago. He's talking about a summit with G8 summit took place in Hokkaido, I think probably, I don't know, 2007, 2008, thereabouts. Now I speak to him 8 years later. And what he was talking about at that meeting, at that point, the Western countries were pushing to put Zimbabwe on the agenda of the UN Security Council. And we were saying the UN Security Council needs to respect international law. And the law that governs the Security Council here is the UN Charter. There was nothing that was happening in Zimbabwe which was a threat to international peace and security. And there was therefore no reason to put the matter of Zimbabwe on the agenda of the Security Council. Put it on the agenda of the Human Rights Council and those sorts of people. And indeed, the President Hu Jintao agreed, and when the matter came up at the Security Council, put by the Americans and the British, they vetoed it. So the ambassador says to me, and President, that was the last time any African talked to us about African issues. He says that was the last time, 8 years ago. So now we complain. We complain when we don't get the sorts of action that we need, but we do nothing about it. So I would say that specifically with regard to China, the important thing is that these Chinese, the second biggest economy in the world and all of that, obviously have got their own national interests and will pursue those interests very vigorously. But we should identify what our own interests are. And this particular second biggest economy in the world has accepted that the relationship between itself and Africa must be constructed on a negotiated basis. Why are we not taking advantage of that? Maybe it's because there is this absence of this policy sovereignty. So we don't know what to do, we don't know what to say. As a consequence, you get negative results, even for people who want to cooperate with us to produce positive results. There matter that's raised about why Africa is not taking off, and there are many reasons. The 2001, 2, 3, thereabouts, during that period, the people of the Comoros negotiate a transition from military rule to democratic rule and adopt a new constitution and all of that, and then hold elections, etc. after that. Then this year, the president of the Comoros convenes what he calls a national dialogue, which results, among other things, in a decision to draft a new constitution, which has been done, which constitution reverses the democratic gains that were made 2001, 2002, 2003. As part of that, he closes down the Constitutional Court. So there's no Constitutional Court to adjudicate matters that have to do with constitutional matters. He's calling for early elections. Elections should have come later, but he's calling for early elections. Has dissolved the Electoral Commission and said he's going to run the elections himself. He's a candidate. Last month there was an extraordinary meeting of the summit meeting of the African Union to discuss the reform of the AU. The president of the Commons was there at that meeting, and he was one of the speakers. And nobody says no buts. You violated this charter of the AU, and so on, the things that you are doing. Nobody did. He spoke, and you know, and my view is that the continent has elaborated many policy positions through the OAU and the AU about the politics of the continent, about the economy, about the gender question, about children, about peace and security, about many things. There's no policy void in that broad sense. The void is this thing that Bayo is talking about. The will to act, to implement these policies which have been agreed. We are going to have elections in the DRC just now. 5 days' time. The two leading opposition candidates are excluded. And my fear, I hope my fear is wrong, is that after this election there'll be conflict in the DRC. And I think all of us across the continent can see it, can see this thing coming, but we don't act. Why? I don't know. The point that is made about the need to use the agreement with the Chinese to strengthen CODESRIA, I would agree with that. I think it's consistent with the point that Jimmy Adeshina was making. We need this intellectual capacity. The continent needs this intellectual capacity to be able properly to address its challenges and interact with the rest of the world, not as a junior, not as some people who don't know what. The last thing I want to say, before I sit down, it's not directly African, but it's part of the Malays. Many years ago, we attended a summit, another summit of the ACP countries. It was held in Fiji. I discovered then that Fiji is very, very far away. So we attended, the government insisted that they want us to attend, and the reason we discover is because the negotiators of the ACP countries were borrowing negotiators from the EU to prepare for negotiations with the EU. It's a complete absurdity. So then we had to, they raised the matter, and so we had then to take on the job of training trade negotiators ourselves. But up to that point, the ACP countries were, their facilitators were the EU itself. I think that's part of what is wrong with Africa. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll move to the left side of the hall, Taladidia Tombiano.
Alors, mon commentaire, j'ai l'impression, après votre exposé, que l'Afrique cultive des paradoxes. C'est-à-dire, voilà un continent qui aime dormir sur la natte des autres, tout en ayant beaucoup de paille. En d'autres termes, on refuse de couper cette paille-là, de tisser et de dormir sur nos propres nattes. Qu'est-ce que cela signifie? Vous avez parlé des différents plans qui ont fait l'objet d'échecs. Pourquoi il y a eu ces échecs? Parce que tout simplement, dans ces plans, l'Afrique n'a jamais identifié qui doit financer ces principaux plans. Ça a été le cas avec le plan de Lagos. Ça a été le cas avec d'autres plans. Et vous voyez que dans ces conditions, il est difficile que l'Afrique puisse effectivement décoller. Nous disposons de toutes les matières premières du monde, de toutes les richesses, mais nous ne sommes pas capables de mettre en valeur ces richesses-là de façon à pouvoir financer notre développement. Et nous tendons continuellement la main pour qu'on nous finance. Or, on sait que le financement et le développement, par exemple, de l'Afrique, ça peut traduire aussi le sous-développement de l'Europe. On fonde aujourd'hui beaucoup d'espoir sur la Chine, mais je ne pense pas que les objectifs donc, des Chinois, même s'ils ne nous ont pas colonisés, soient totalement différents des préoccupations donc, de l'Europe, des États-Unis, etc., etc. Pour moi, nous devons d'abord endogéniser notre développement à travers un financement autonome. Sinon, je ne pense pas que dans 50 ans, nous soyons à même donc de décoller. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Zen Tadase.
I wanted to ask His Excellency, is it really a lack of capacity that people are not reporting back about the capital flight report? Or is it because we depend so much on FDI as the most important aspect of our development strategy? And as a result, fight among each other about who is going to give the best conditions for FDI. I do recognize we might lack sufficient capacity to negotiate, but I think the most important is what was said yesterday, that we have not really benefited from FDI in a way that could be useful for future Africa development, as opposed to giving away all the riches of the continent. I wanted to join what Jimmy had said, that CODESRIA should indeed engage in Sino-Africa studies, but in a very critical way, as has been the tradition of CODESRIA. I see Chinese colleagues here, and therefore, perhaps if we keep the critical edge of the CODESRIA history and examine both objectively and critically the emergent Sino-Africa relationship, I think it will be mutually beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa Muyo.
Thank you, Chairperson. Your Excellency, thank you very much for a very, very interesting lecture. Some time ago, I think you coordinated, or you were in charge of a commission on illicit financial flows out of Africa, and you stated it's billions that are leaving the continent, which means if there was a way to actually find ways to prevent that, and we tap on those resources that would otherwise go out, we would have a very huge basis for our own self-financing of what we want to do. So I want to ask if maybe you can elaborate based on that study that you coordinated. How do we go about capturing those resources or stopping those illicit financial flows? I've also heard that because of the rich mineral base that Africa has, another possible source of funding could be setting up sovereign wealth funds. Is that feasible in your opinion? How do we go about it? I'm also one of those who think, finally.
Thank you, please.
Or just one last thing? Okay. So finally, I also tend to think that one of the challenges we have in Africa is, with due respect to what AU has been trying to do, I think governance is a serious limitation, it's a serious issue. And I'm reminded of what the late Semi Amin proposed. One of his biggest proposals was, at the end of the day, it's not going to be the elites who are going to liberate the continent, but the downtrodden, the farmers, the peasants, the social movements. Is this something that you think is a possible solution? So in that case, how do you actually mobilize, revive social movements in Africa to challenge the weak leadership, the reluctant leadership that we seem to see, because they seem to be paralyzed when they go to the negotiating table?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you. Tandika Kandawiri.
For an inspiring lecture, if I call it that. I was fascinated by one point that we made towards the end, which is really the capacity of our regional institutions. And I can propose but 4 reasons why I think they're very weak. One, obviously, is that the capture of the African Union by the European Union. There are many programs now which are entirely funded by outsiders. And if you look at the original OAU, it did not allow external funding.
And over the years, that changed. Of course, this partly because members don't pay their fees, as you said earlier. The second, I think, is an ideational problem. If you look at the first bureaucrats of the European Union, the so-called Eurocrats, these were young Europeans tired of war and committed to creating a new Europe. We need some kind of Afrocrats, that is competent, highly competent people, ideologically clear about why they are in. Most of our regional bureaucrats, I have met one who didn't even know who Nkrumah was, and he was working for a regional organization. Thirdly, something has gone wrong at the national level. There are no national projects. If the Chinese give you money and they say you can use it the way you choose, and you ask for a stadium, because you have no development project, and I think that's really one of the effects of structural adjustment was to destroy any national project, and that, of course, led on impact on the OU. The last question is a question of democracy. I'm convinced, well, at least history seems to say so, there has never been a federation of dictators. And so we have had heads of state, they go and sign an agreement. It's never reported at home, it's never discussed at home. There's never been, nobody has lost an election for messing up something about the African Union. So I think we have to insist on this democratic governance at national level if the continental project is be anchored on a popular basis.
Thank you very much. Go right to the back. That's Olomola.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. President, for the very illuminating and inspiring lecture. I am Adebayo Olomola from the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research, Ibadan. I'm really touched about the concern regarding the weakness of the important instrument in Africa that should have reacted to the various weaknesses we are witnessing at the policy design level and also at the policy implementation level. In terms of the AU itself, a potent instrument that should have demonstrated leadership. And these days, that nationalism is itself now being glorified in the US. And these days, when trade wars will be an important instrument to fight the proposals and the negotiated agreements Africa has achieved, we really need to sit up and start to monitor our policies. The African peer review mechanism has been an important mechanism which the President, Your Excellency, himself, and other respected African leaders spearheaded. There is also weakening and almost collapsing. Meanwhile, the IMF will continue to monitor and will be the full soldiers in this fight against African positions. Every month, they monitor us. They sit at policy level to direct the policies. For example, the agricultural subsidy, which is an important contention at the development negotiated of the Doha round, for example. You find that in many African countries, this policy has completely really been weakened, such that there is no country that we can say, well, it's supporting its agriculture. And if you see what is happening in terms of export subsidy, and even input subsidy in developed countries, it has weakened the base of Africa's development, and that is agriculture.
Thank you.
How can we strengthen the African Union to really monitor and stand against this impending war and looming crisis? That is the real question.
Thank you very much. Jacques Chibouabo.
Monsieur le Président, merci pour la conférence. Deux petites questions. Il était prévu que vous veniez en RDC, vous avez fait allusion à la RDC tout à l'heure. Il était prévu que vous veniez en RDC pour assurer la médiation entre justement la classe dirigeante ainsi que l'opposition. Vous n'êtes plus venu en RDC, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé au juste? Deuxième question, il y a un contrat qui a été signé entre la RDC et la Chine. Il a été appelé contrat du siècle. Est-ce que ce contrat vous a été montré? Vous avez dit que tout contrat qui serait signé entre la Chine et un pays africain devait être soumis à votre appréciation. Avez-vous vu ce contrat? D'autant plus que c'était un contrat alambiqué et déséquilibré. Donc, merci.
Thank you. Okay, sound bites now, please, so that we don't eat too much into the next session. Awesome. Nico, awesome. Welcome back.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I want to go historical. Every historical epoch is characterized by its own outstanding leader. At one point, we had Britain reigning, and after 1945, we had America taking lead in the West. Our problem in Africa today, when we say Africans are too weak to negotiate arrangements, we have two great powers. One, South Africa. Two, Nigeria. Now, where is the problem? Every voice in Africa is not the same and does not count. Why are we talking about our capacity to negotiate, as if all the fingers are the same? Who is taking the initiative? Where is the deficit?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You've been very patient, Sheriff Salifsi. One minute, Sheriff. I know you have a lot to say. 1 minute, please. Please.
Bienvenue, Excellence Thabo Mbeki. Je suis le docteur Sheriff Salifsi, ancien ministre conseiller économique du président de la République du Sénégal. Je suis membre du CODESRIA et je suis le nouveau directeur du Forum du Tiers-Monde à la place de Samir Amin. J'ai travaillé 2 ans à vos côtés. L'ambassadeur Samba Bourimbouk, ici présent, va en témoigner. Je vous suis, je vous lis et je remarque que vous êtes sur la même trajectoire. Ce que vous dites n'est ni une dénonciation de ce qui se fait à l'Union africaine, ni une critique à n'importe quel chef d'État. Vous le dites depuis toujours. C'est simplement des contributions, à mon avis, qui méritent d'être prises en compte. Je crois que ce qu'on attend d'un chef d'État, un ancien chef d'État, c'est de procéder, je crois, de cette façon. Continuer à avoir un regard critique sur la marche du continent et surtout, et c'est cela qui est le plus important, avoir la capacité de formuler des alternatives crédibles et réalisables. Sur les négociations à ACP, nos capacités de négociation, il suffit de se rendre à Genève pour voir la carence des pays africains, indépendamment de l'Afrique du Sud. Les Occidentaux, ils sont en permanence avec des bureaux qui fonctionnent toute l'année. Ils sont tout le temps en train de discuter et dans les couloirs. À part l'Afrique du Sud, tous les autres pays africains viennent 3 jours avant l'ouverture de négociations. Je pense que ça aussi, c'est un aspect de l'incapacité de nos États à négocier sérieusement. Je ne commande pas ce que vous avez dit sur John Bolton. Le silence est édifiant sur le continent par rapport à ce qu'il a dit. Sur la Chine, j'y étais souvent comme officiel, mais j'ai été récemment avec Samir Amin au mois de juin dernier pour discuter de questions sérieuses, notamment autour des souverainetés. Et ce qui m'a frappé, et c'est pour cette raison que je ne fais pas de critique aux Chinois, c'est ce que nous disent les officiels. Et je les cite, ils disent, Dr Si, professeur Samin, ce qui est extraordinaire avec votre continent, c'est que très souvent, nous n'avons pas l'impression d'avoir des interlocuteurs. C'est nous qui passons notre temps à dire ce que nous voulons. Et enfin, dans une conférence sur Cheikh Anta Diop, je crois qu'il faut qu'on sorte la construction de l'avenir de notre continent à l'horizon de nos relations avec les pays développés. Madame a raison. Il faut qu'on dise haut et fort que l'avenir de l'Afrique dépend des Africains. C'est à eux de faire le travail nécessaire pour une alternative sur un continent où toutes nos populations pourraient vivre dignes et épanouies. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Derrière vous, Ebrima Sall.
Thank you, President Mbeki. Just 2 quick points. I think your lecture says something about the way the engagement between research and policy is happening on the continent. And you also say something about civil society. When Shinkai, when Jiangping was the chairperson of the African Union Commission, we met with Shinkai, the chief of staff then. And so the point about what Tandika is saying, Afrocrats and who is there, it matters who is there in the commission. Shinkai gave us time in a very, very busy period. He took time away from a budget session to talk with us about how CODESRIA could work with the African Union on the key issues on the agenda of the African Union, particularly the partnerships. It is China, it's also Turkey, it's the European Union, it's Brazil, it's all these countries that are intervening. So how can African research be engaging with those issues, and when it comes to negotiations, research could maybe help in at least, pointing out some of the issues that they should be aware of as they negotiate. Now, Shinkai moved shortly after because there was a change, and we never managed to get the same kind of relationship with the following team. We had a memorandum of understanding with the African Union Political Affairs Department, but it didn't get to a certain level of operationalization. Second point, very quickly, is I think the point you are making about illicit financial flows tells us something about African civil society. The consortium that you chair, President Mbeki, on to stem illicit financial flows meets every year. There is a working group. There's been a campaign to stop the bleeding, but civil society can have a campaign, carry out a campaign to get African governments to report on these issues, as they're getting them to report on human rights issues and other issues as well. So I think, back to the point that was made by Honor-Lena, part of the problem is actually what we do as scholars, how we engage with policy, but also as civil society activists, for those who are in activism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me go to the back again. Samba.
Mr. President Siabonga Gakulu, thank you very much. Mr. President, I support the idea of having this CODESRIA initiative to strengthen Africa's capacity of negotiation, starting with looking critically, starting from yesterday, at these very beautiful framework of action, with China, critically. And if you can do it together with other think tanks and other people, co-opt whoever you think can help do the job, and start doing it yesterday. It's very, very important. Mr. President, I'm back from Accra, where we were commemorating the 60th anniversary of the All African People's Conference, 1958. And after that, we had the pre-Congress of the Pan-African Federalist Movement. We missed you, we received your message, and once again, Siabonga Gakulu for your support. Now, one of the issues that we discussed was the issue of reparations. And within the issue of reparations, we are demanding that Africa has, it has been said here, a seat on the in the Security Council. But there are others. I know that in Africa, the issue of reparations is something like taboo. But within the African diaspora, CARICOM, etc., people are ready. So it can be a rallying point. Now, we are doing that as the Pan-African Federalist Movement, and our aim is to bring Africa together within one generation or less than a generation. And we are very motivated and dedicated to doing that through building a powerful citizens movement that will put pressure on our current rulership, not leadership, because that is the problem of Africa. Africa is very rich in rulers and very poor in leaders. So we have to get rid of these people, and it has become a matter of life or death. All our problems are problems of leadership or the lack of them. So while we do that to get rid of them, and the sooner the better, let's start implementing through projects and development programs this image of the future that we want to build for our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor Sawyer. you are chairing that conference in Accra. Want to come?
Thank you, Mr. President. And Bayo, I'll take your warning about sound bites very seriously.
Thank you.
And just give a sound bite. I support the notion of intellectual input into the work of the AU. The point about the need to build capacity to negotiate at the AU level, that will help. But I think we should not forget the base of the problem. It's not the AU, not China, not John Bolton. It is in the nature of the new colonial state and the interests it pushes or doesn't push. Very briefly, we are all aware of so many instances at the national level where states bypass capacity and choose to make agreements which are negative. So let's not have any naive hopes that by making the right points to our leaders, they will therefore do it right.
Thank you.
We've got to begin at national level, get our policy frameworks right, or we are shooting at the empty sky. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a guy who's been very patient in the middle here. Thank you.
Mr. President, I almost gave up. I thought I would not get a chance to ask this question. I'm Ken Walibora from Riara University, Kenya. My question is about optimism. And it's very short. I wanted to find out from you your thinking, your current thinking on the narrative of African rising. Is that still current with you? Because we associate you with African Renaissance and things like that. What do you think of Africa in the next 50, 100 years? Can you share that with us? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it is Ben Fredge. Yeah. Winding this down now, Executive Secretary, and then I'll invite President Mbeki to have final reflections.
Président, donc après avoir entendu votre brillant exposé, peut-on dire que les processus engagés par les Nations Unies, les OMD, les ODD et les 17 objectifs qui ne font qu'entretenir notre rêve d'un monde meilleur sont encore valables? Peut-on toujours y croire? Est-ce que ces processus sont réels ou bien sont illusoires devant des projets qui ne font que nous enfoncer encore dans la pauvreté, dans un cadre ou bien dans une logique d'hypocrisie politique et d'hégémonie. Merci.
Thank you very much. Last one, Marima Touré.
Merci Bayo, je pensais que si tu ne me donnais pas la parole, j'allais t'étrangler. Je voudrais remercier le président Mbeki et je voudrais réellement dire que nous apprécions très sérieusement la sincérité qu'il a dans les échanges qu'il a avec nous. Je ne suis pas très optimiste par rapport à la capacité de négociation des Africains. Parce que je ne crois pas que ce soit un problème technique. C'est vrai, il y a un problème technique, il y a des négociateurs qui auraient été peut-être mieux formés. Mais au-delà de la formation des négociateurs, le problème, on l'a déjà dit, se trouve dans la nature de l'État. Le problème se trouve dans la nature des interlocuteurs, parce que pour pouvoir négocier en tant que partenaire, il faut réellement être doté de ce qu'on peut appeler une véritable capacité de négociation, c'est-à-dire la possibilité de dire non. Et je pense que le grand problème des Africains, c'est que face aux institutions de Bretton Woods, ils n'ont pas la possibilité de dire non. Monsieur le Président, vous avez été président avec une génération de présidents qui avaient peut-être un projet pour l'Afrique. Vous avez fait le NEPAD, vous avez théorisé la Renaissance africaine, vous avez fait. Et je pense que le président Abdoulaye Wade, qui était ici au Sénégal, il avait aussi un certain élan à challenger ce qui se disait à la Banque mondiale et ce qui se disait au Fonds monétaire international. Mais tous les présidents africains qui arrivent au pouvoir, au bout de quelques mois, se rendent compte de la réalité. Je voulais dire simplement deux choses. Je ne crois pas, rapidement, Bayo, je voulais renforcer l'idée de dire que le CODESRIA, mais aussi les autres think tanks, doivent plus s'engager dans une réflexion stratégique pour accompagner une institution comme l'Union africaine. Mais je voulais dire que ce que moi, je vais vous demander personnellement, c'est l'engagement de votre autorité et de votre notoriété pour appeler les Africains qui sont à la commande à écouter la communauté intellectuelle africaine. Et que cette communauté intellectuelle n'est pas seulement là pour les insulter, et que cette communauté intellectuelle n'est pas seulement là pour dire les impossibilités, mais cette communauté intellectuelle est aussi consciente de leurs propres difficultés. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Really, the very, very, very last intervention, and then President Mbeki, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Ido Harrison from Obafemi Awolowo University, Nigeria. And thank you, Mr. President, for that very good one. My take is actually on the Africa-China relations, which a lot of people have, I feel, have canonized to the heights that is going to bring development to Africa. And the fear is that, I feel that China is trying to upset the global power structure, and they are very close to that now. Even from your lecture, they are now second place economically in the globe. Now, Africa, what is Africa's interest? Especially, like some of us have said, argued here today, Africa does not actually have their own interest, whereas China has an interest, which they are already targeting. Now, no doubt, Africa has been betrayed a lot of time by Europe. And now, are we not having that? Are we not going to have that fear that soonest that China haven't achieved their interest, which is to become maybe #1 in the world? Are we not going to be betrayed again? Secondly, the funds that China is releasing to Africa. We have mentioned leadership problem in Africa. Are they not being embezzled by our leaders? And what are we doing with those funds? I mean, what is the plight of Africa even in this seemingly negotiated relations between Africa and China? Is it that we are having this fear because of our past betrayal, or are we saying that China mean really good for Africa, sir? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Mr. President, you have the...
Thanks, Bayo. Too many questions. But let me say, just say what I really think about ourselves as a continent. You know, we used to have, when I was a student, we used to have an organization called the All African Students Union. Very good students' union. A lot of the national students' union on the continent belong there. And ASU communicated a progressive image, a progressive message about the Africa we want. Then we had the Pan-African Youth Movement, dealt with the youth more broadly, similar progressive message about the future of Africa. And then we had the Organization of African, it was called, I remember, the Organization of African Trade Union Unity. It brought the unions together, similar progressive message. to all intents and purposes, all three organizations have collapsed. We should ask ourselves the question, why? It would seem to me that the progressive movement, and we may differ about that, what we mean by a progressive movement, that the progressive movement on our continent has collapsed. That's part of the reality that is reflected in many of the comments we're making. It's the absence of a progressive movement. Then just take our case. The South Africans here are going to quarrel with me. You have a progressive national liberation movement, the ANC, old organization and all that. But something went wrong. Today you have, there's a commission, a judicial commission, which is sitting in South Africa. It's called the Judicial Commission on State Capture. And the thesis is that at some point, this democratic state led by the ANC as a governing party got captured by commercial interests. So you have this democratic state, the ANC governing, which is captured by commercial interests, not to serve the interests of the people, but to serve the interests of a corporate elite. That represented a weakening of a progressive movement. When it begins to lose its progressive character, it assumes another character. So you have entrenched corruption. It becomes very pervasive. You have this thing that Tandika is raising about, what did you call them, Tandika? Afrocrats. You have, if you look at the South African government institutions, during this period of the state capture, you can see the quality of the government institutions declining, quality of your civil servant, your public servant, and the institutions of government. You have the institutions themselves being corrupted. Whether it's the police or the prosecuting authority. You have a very interesting case of the revenue services. Some commission investigates what's happened to revenue services, and you can see in the account that's given of a systematic effort to destroy the revenue services, to capture them in order to do something other than provide resources which can be used for the upliftment of the people. I'm saying it comes because of the loss of a progressive direction by the ANC. It has its negative consequences. Now you can repeat that example throughout the continent. So when we talk about we need a better African Union. We need democratic governance. We need all this, not just the capacity, but the will to stand up for African interests and so on. I'm saying that in the end, we're talking about rebuilding a progressive movement. The references to the intervention of civil society, for instance, an intervention from below in order to impact on these people at the top who are doing wrong things. I think it's a discussion about what is it that we do to rebuild this progressive movement on the continent. And I think that's a big challenge. So an ad hoc response to particular manifestations of wrong things is not going to help us. In the end, we need a systemic intervention to say what is it that we need to do to rebuild that progressive movement. That's a big challenge. So all of this matters indeed about management of our own resources, point that was made about autonomous funding, even this thing about dealing with the matter of illicit financial outflows. It's a very important issue. For instance, there's a particular law firm in South Africa which volunteered to work with us on the matter of the internal illicit financial outflows, particularly on a matter called transfer pricing. And this law firm said, we are very familiar with this phenomenon of transfer pricing because we have been advising the corporate world about how to do it. But we're African lawyers, and when we've seen what you people are saying, we thought that, in a sense, we are going to cross the road and join you to develop a tool to deal with this matter about transfer pricing. And so indeed, they've worked on it. And they say to us that during the first year of the operation of this tool, they know of at least 4 countries on the continent, each one of which would get at least $1 billion a year just from dealing with this problem of transfer pricing. So it's an illustration of the size of the problem of these illicit financial outflows. I think our leadership on the continent understands that, and therefore understands the benefits that would accrue to each one of our countries if we were to deal with this matter. But you get to an oil-producing country, which I won't name I will not name. It's an oil-producing country. The government reports about how much oil is produced and how much oil is exported is entirely based on what the oil companies report. I don't say, yeah. The customs authorities in this particular country have the physical capacity to measure the oil that's produced and the oil that is exported. But that function has been taken away from them and placed in another government department which does not have the capacity, and therefore depends on what the oil companies report. Indeed, the president whispered to me there that he is certain that the oil companies are underreporting what they are producing by at least a third. So there's something that's not right about that. You'll find it, I'm saying this is a general problem. Mwai Kibaki, president of Kenya, when he was president, he was saying to us that one of the strange things in Kenya, and actually it's not only Kenyan, he said you've got companies in Kenya that have lost money every single year. That's why they have not paid any tax. But they never go bankrupt. There's something wrong with that. But why it's not acted upon, I'm saying it's this weakness of this progressive movement, this progressive voice. A head of state who is a thief who abuses their power to put money into their pockets is not about to do the right things that we're talking about. To go to an AU summit, a decision is taken and report to the people. Or go to Beijing and come and report to the people. They're not going to do that. And so, what is it that we do? Maybe CODESRIA can help us in this regard. What is it that we need to do on the continent to rebuild the progressive movement, which when it was there, brought about this great achievement of the total liberation of our continent? We need another form of liberation now, covering all of these matters that everybody has been raising. But how shall we build that movement? Where is it going to come from? There is no school where you train progressive leaders. It doesn't exist. But we need them. Our colleague was asking about the DRC. I've been trying to visit, to go to the DRC to speak to President Kabila for some time now, for almost 2 years. He always agrees with me that yes, indeed, we must meet. I'll give you a date, and never does. So I have not been there. The last statement he made via a spokesperson was that he doesn't want me in the Congo. When one day we will go there. And I have had this issue about the contract between China and the Democratic Republic of Congo, but we've never had a look at it. But I've had people talk about that. But I'm saying in the end, even this question about the relations between Nigeria and South Africa that's raised. These two countries used to work very well together. Then something went wrong. And I think at the base of it is, again, this weakening of a progressive base, without which we will wish for many things to happen. But in the end, I think the strategic task must surely be to rebuild this progressive movement, without which it would be impossible to address any of these issues. And I would say to ANC people from South Africa who are here, in the South African case, to reverse the negatives that have happened, which have led now to the Commission on State Capture and all of this thing, the ANC must do everything to recover its progressive roots. Without that, thanks, bye.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think rather than feel pessimistic, even disempowered by the painful situation, your living example is actually a good reason for all of us to feel empowered and to recognize that it is doable, it is possible. If we have leaders in our midst like you, who not only in terms of the history of commitment, but also the continuing engagement which you have shown in South Africa and beyond, Comoros, Sudan, South Sudan, trying to promote peace on behalf of the AU, on behalf of the UN, on behalf of the continent. One anecdote, whatever it was you delivered to us today, intervention or lecture, we know 100% that it was written by you entirely. And it's not very many African leaders who even read the speeches written for them properly. Let me invite Rukaya, please, to come forward. Professor Rukaya Fall, Cheikh Anta Diop University, member of the Executive Committee of CODESRIA, to move a vote of thanks to President Mbeki.
Merci, Bayo. Merci. Excellence, Président Thabo Mbeki, chers membres du CODESRIA, distingués invités, c'est un honneur pour moi. C'est un honneur d'être là devant vous pour adresser au nom du CODESRIA cette motion de remerciement. Motion de remerciement adressée à une personnalité devenue, grâce à ses réflexions, grâce aux idées qu'il essaie de mettre à jour, grâce aux actions qu'il mène, une personnalité devenue l'une des figures emblématiques du panafricanisme. L'engagement du président Mbeki pour le panafricanisme ne se résume pas seulement dans son célèbre discours « I am an African ». Mais cet engagement se mesure aussi et surtout par le travail qu'il a accompli et qu'il poursuit pour faire entendre et montrer la voix et l'identité de l'Afrique. Le CODESRIA lui est particulièrement reconnaissant pour son immense contribution au projet Tombouctou. Ce projet qui a été une véritable collaboration panafricaine. Et ce projet qui a abouti à la publication du livre The Meanings of Timbuktu, publié par le CODESRIA et le HSRC en 2008, qui a été traduit en français en 2012, Tombouctou pour une histoire de l'érudition en Afrique de l'Ouest. Nous rappelons aussi brièvement, cela a été dit ici, que le président Mbeki a été également membre fondateur du NEPAD. Ce NEPAD qui cherchait à réinventer une Afrique interconnectée sans frontières. Je pense qu'à la lumière des échanges qui ont été faits ici, nous pouvons continuer à espérer que ce rêve d'une Afrique sans visa se réalisera un jour. Pour la conférence Cheikh Anta Diop, du nom de cet autre grand Africain, choix ne pouvait être plus judicieux que celui du président Mbeki, l'intellectuel et panafricaniste convaincu. Au nom du CODESRIA, Monsieur le Président, au nom de la communauté africaine des sciences sociales et humaines, je voudrais vous dire merci. Merci en leur nom. Merci dans ma langue maternelle, Djokandjal, Serer, et Nkosi dans la vôtre. Merci beaucoup.
I won't add anything beyond that, just to say that in the tradition that we began yesterday, we want to brand ourselves either in your home or in your office. And I would like to ask Rukaya to come and present this to the President. It's our way of saying thank you very much. It's our way of also acknowledging that the challenges that you've thrown are challenges worth the time. And we are happy that you've invited us into a dialogue. And we will be reaching out to you many more times. And each time we come, please look at this and remember that we made a pact at the 15th CODESRIA General Assembly where you gave a lecture. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the Cheikh Anta Diop lecture stroke intervention. I would like to ask us to take a quick tea break, 15 to 20 minutes, and then please come back for the next session, which we are running late. I am not complaining. I feel satisfied and happy that we have spent the morning very well. Thank you very much and see you soon.